I know this topic is really about dealing with pressure and I suppose by extension, anxiety as well. But maybe a good starting point would be for us to really understand what is pressure.
That is a great question, because it's something that we live with every single day, but actually, do we take the time to define it? So scientifically, pressure is defined as the physical force of an object. But what we're talking about here is human beings and the pressure that we have. And so when I think about it, there's four key areas that are closely linked. There's the emotional and physical pressure, and then there's also the internal and external pressure. So from an emotional perspective, you've got your mindset and how you're feeling in your thoughts. What's your internal state like? And then you've obviously got physical pressure, which might well be how your body's reacting, or literally physical pressure on your body. And then internal and external is also interesting, because external, you might well have pressure from your boss or your family or the world in general. But also there's an element of internal pressure. What do we put on ourselves? What's that internal voice that's running to just top things up for us?
That's interesting that you say that, because I mean, a lot of the things I suppose we don't associate with pressure per se, but more like just part and parcel of dealing with the world around us. So I suppose, how do we kind of define it for ourselves in the way that we can acknowledge that this is in fact pressure, regardless of whether it's good or bad, which we can talk about later, of course. And then at least in our mind, we have a mental idea, a good idea of what it is and what we should be taking note of.
I think what you just touched upon, which is really important, is that we're all so different. One thing for me that might feel like a pressurized situation for you might well be a walk in the park, something super easy that you wouldn't put much thought into. And so I think the first step is to get really clear and define for ourselves, what does pressure mean for me, and how does it show up in my body, in my mind? Because again, the feelings that you and I might have, or anyone, might well be different. I think a really good place to start, though, is that so often pressure shows up in a physical response and it manifests in our body. So if we can check in those moments and say, hey, my palms are sweating, or my heart rate's increased, I'm feeling a little queasy, or something's a bit of a miss, I think that's a great indicator of where actually the pressure might have tipped over into something that's not serving you as well.
Yeah. Is it the case where we notice the sensations within our body and mind first, or is it us noticing that this is a point of pressure for us? Which one? I mean, is it easy to kind of figure out which one is the one we should take notice of individually, or is it the case where it's just naturally instinctive for us to notice the physical sensations first?
I think ideally we want to know how we react to pressure, because when you are in a pressurized situation, you might be thinking, oh my God, I'm now in a pressurized situation. How on earth am I going to react? Whereas taking a few steps backwards and knowing what pressure points are for you, or knowing how you might well react, and be able to catch those warning signs far earlier, is only going to benefit you. So I think it's almost kind of taking a few steps back from right, I'm now reacting either internally or externally.
Right. It's interesting for me. Is it something that in your experience, where it's possible for us to reflect on our past pressure experiencing moments and kind of notice what it is, or what are the sensations we feel, or what we are thinking? Or is it something that, through time we just kind of forget, and we have to wait for the next experience to really get an accurate picture? Because I myself am trying to remember the last time I felt pressure, but to be honest, I don't feel for lack of a better word, the pain I felt probably then. So I'm wondering how accurate it would be if I use hindsight.
I think we can really learn from hindsight. There's an amazing lady called Carol Dweck who talks about a growth mindset, which I know has come up in previous podcasts of yours. But what she talks about is how we can really learn from our experiences and take all the valuable information, even if it hasn't worked out as well as we hoped it would have done. So by looking back on previous experiences, we can notice what happened, what led to that moment that maybe it did tip over. And I think by getting very curious about the steps that led to that will only be a good thing. Because usually when we're in a moment, things become more pressurized without us even realizing. So little things like we might be having a bad night's sleep, or we might be eating too much or too little, or doing a little too much exercise or too little exercise. We're not moving our bodies enough. We might be procrastinating. We might have a little difficulty concentrating. All of these things that we kind of shrug off as, oh, it's just a bad day at the office, or a bad day. Actually, those are little signs, almost kind of warning signals that we can learn from to make sure that we're better prepared in the future.
Yeah, well, it sounds like we have the added responsibility to be mindful, which is in and of itself a greater challenge that most of us face. Is there a distinction between positive and negative pressure? And I suppose if so, how do we identify which is which, I guess?
There's definitely a difference. It's very clear. For me, how I see the difference is positive pressure will motivate you and negative pressure will cripple you. So if you take that into an example, if you are, imagine you're a heavyweight boxer and you are training for a world championship or some mega fight against an amazing competitor that you're really anxious about. However, does that motivate you? Do you train harder? Do you eat better and work faster? All of those things. Or does it take you over to another level where actually it cripples you? It makes you not be able to think clearly. It doesn't help you perform at your best. I think if we can make sure that the pressure is motivating us to push us to our best, then that's a good thing.
Is there a way that we can change that negative pressure, as you said, the ones that cripple us, and change it towards a more positive, to create a more positive environment for us so that, because I'm assuming that sometimes we don't have the luxury of choice, right? Where in the sense that the things that we want to do and accomplish in life often requires doing things we don't want to do. And if we experience pressure during those moments, we don't want it to cripple us so that we can continue. So I'm thinking, I'm wondering if there's a way we can kind of change that negative experience to a more positive one.
There's so many ways to change that message to make sure that it's more positive. There's a number of different things about even identifying that voice or that internal dialogue that you might be having to make sure that it stays positive rather than negative. I always like to think of pressure as a balloon. When it's positive, it just blows up. We love balloons. They're a celebration. They symbolize really kind of positive and uplifting things. And actually, when the pressure becomes too much, it bursts. The balloon pops. And so how can we recognize when that pressure point has maybe changed and the balloon is metaphorically about to pop? And there's a number of different things. Even again, it's kind of setting yourself up for success by creating healthy habits and putting yourself in the best space physically, emotionally, to be able to think clearly, to be able to build that resilience to deal with negative pressure.
and how do we start to think about it, I suppose, in that way? So we use the analogy of the balloon, which is a great analogy because it's very easy to visualize, right?
Yeah.
Like, so let's say, oh, we are, it is, at its maximum capacity, and it's about to burst. How do we then, well, number one, notice it, because oftentimes we feel like, there's more that we can do. But also, how do we kind of recognize, when we blow the next balloon, like, what is that limit? How can we be more aware of that?
So a great place to start, kind of tied into what we were discussing earlier about looking back at previous experiences, is you can start to write down and notice all the components of that. So whether that was a very demanding boss or a timeline that you had to meet, a deadline, and what happened in your body, because by journaling, it's down on paper, you can see what's happened and track it, essentially. That's what we want to be able to do, is track, so that as we go into these situations, we're thinking, hey, my balloon is now reaching near enough, it's hitting its limit. And so how can I either tie up the balloon or let out a bit of gas, to make sure that it doesn't burst? So I think, as you said, awareness is such a key part of dealing with pressure, but then also having some of the tools to keep you calm and to be able to handle those moments. Because ultimately, in those moments, when it tips over into a negative pressure, we react in a flight, fight, or freeze response. And that doesn't serve us. So what that is about is, if we go back to our ancestors and the cavemen, they would have threats to their survival in front of their face. So, for example, they would have a saber-toothed tiger in front of them, and their body would naturally go into a response that would protect them and keep them safe. So flight, obviously they would be fleeing the scene to get away from the saber-toothed tiger, or they would fight it and be ready for that. The difficulty is that today there's no saber-toothed tiger in front of us. And so how can we make sure that that concoction of hormones that get released in that moment, the cortisol, the adrenaline, how can we make sure that that doesn't start, so that our thought is not clouded, our body has not shut down, and we are able to deal with it clearly and with confidence, rather than in a panicked, anxious state.
Got it. Is there some examples that can sort of provide a good visualization of what that looks like? So that I mean, because in theory it's easy to understand, but I'm just trying to help, I guess, our listeners visualize it in a way that they can easily relate to.
Visualize the flight.
No, not so much that, but like, how do they recognize that moment? An example of that in a real world setting, because I mean, the fight or flight it's in the real world, I suppose, is a lot more of a psychological response now, more than a physical one, right? Because we don't see the dangers of a saber tooth. So what's a good example, I suppose, that we can all relate to, that we can go, oh, okay, that's what I'm doing.
Good question. I'll tell you two things. So I'll start with another metaphor, which is similar to the balloon, but I think displays it really powerfully. Is that if you think of a bottle of soda, so a bottle of Coca-Cola, is that pressure builds and builds, and actually, if you open it correctly in a positive light, it just goes shh, and it's so good. However, if it's tipped over and it's become too negative, it explodes everywhere, and the whole thing is a chaos. And so I think if we take a kind of real life example of that, well, actually, a really interesting one is Steve Jobs. Everyone studied him in a huge amount of detail, and I think what he became particularly famous for was making impossible tasks possible. And so a really good example of that is back in 2005, they were creating the iPhone, and the engineers were saying, we want a month to do this. This is going to take time. We need to do it well. And Steve Jobs said, no, I want it in 2 weeks. So they scrambled. And you can imagine that the pressure in those moments would have been sky high. They said it wasn't possible. We can't do it. However, they achieved it, and they created these items, these objects of excellence that they didn't even think was possible, let alone in the time frames. And so they should almost write a thesis on this, because it'd be so interesting to see how different people react to this story. Because I think one person might well say, that's amazing. They were pushed to such a peak level and they were able to achieve so much. But the next person might well say, yeah, but how many people were burnt out? Were they able to cope? Was it too much of a stretch for them? And so maybe that's a good example. Did that kind of answer your question? Maybe that's a good example to kind of demonstrate that there's always two sides. There's always different people with different experiences and different tolerance levels.
It does, yeah, and it also brings up a very good thought or question, because that example is so clear and something that we all know. And I suppose at the end of the day, maybe even before we look at pressure, we need to look at I suppose the values we hold true, right? Because some people, maybe if Steve Jobs says you have 2 weeks, they'll be like, listen, man, I don't really care about the iPhone.
I don't care, whatever.
Yeah, I mean, this is not for me. Whereas some people will be like, you know what, 2 weeks to build a great product, that's what fuels me, And so I suppose that maybe the pressure, learning about how you deal with pressure, also has something to do with what you consider a valuable use of your time, what is important to you, and all that jazz. But I guess correct me if I'm wrong.
No, I completely agree. And it goes to Simon Sinek's work of Start With Why. And he even used Apple as his example in the TED Talk that made him so famous. But he talks about why we do what we do. And ultimately, if you can get people who are working in your teams and organizations who are bought into that, then I would have thought that most people at Apple, well, that's why it'd be so interesting to kind of dig into it deeper. But I would have thought that the majority of that team actually thrived on that pressure and thought, this is just the coolest opportunity that I am able to be a part of. And I'm sure that once they achieved it, I mean, it must have been pretty phenomenal.
Yeah.
But I wonder how many people were also in the side going, oh my God, that was just too much. I can't, I need a break.
Like reaching out to recruiters. And,
yeah, exactly. Reaching out to coaches, recruiters, therapists.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I suppose which also ties back to the point you made indirectly about, I suppose, the sustainability of it all, right? Like, I mean, you can put yourself under all these pressures, but do you have an outlet to decompress? Because if you don't, then regardless of whether it's good or bad pressure, I can't imagine it'll end well for anyone.
I think that's it. It's another good way to deal with it. Going back to what we were discussing earlier about creating good habits, is that we need time to decompress and we need time to switch off. And I think it is particularly hard at the moment because the boundaries are blurred between work and play. And, we were even talking just before we jumped on to the recording that I had, in inverted commas, a holiday last week, but I still ended up doing things because it's harder to switch off when you don't have that physical space. So it is really, really important to decompress and create the right routines that offer that space. So even if that's in the middle of the day, going for a walk, taking 10, journaling, doing a meditation, listening to a podcast, catching up with a friend, and understanding yourself and what fills you up and what gives you energy versus what kind of drains it and sucks it away is really key in that process.
Yeah, I agree. Which I think is a good segue to I suppose the topic of anxiety and I know you spoke about your experience with it as well, and that's why you also wrote a book about it. But
Mm-hmm.
I'd be interested to know, what was your experience with anxiety, and when did you figure? I suppose something I'm always curious about asking is like, when did you figure out that that was anxiety and it was an issue?
Great question. So if I rewind, so I used to be in financial services recruitment, which was brilliant in many ways. There was a lot about it that I really loved and was good at, but it was a very intensely pressurized role. We had weekly, monthly, quarterly targets. I also managed a team, so was responsible for them. And through that, it just got to a point when I thought, I'm not able to cope with this. Topped off that I was also getting married at the time. And I remember I didn't really understand anxiety. I'd had a pretty free run until that point. I felt very fortunate. But I got to this point and I thought, I have no idea what's happening to me. I genuinely don't know what's happening in my body and my mind. I'm not able to function as I usually do. And quite frankly, I'm scared. Like, I don't understand what's happening. And I think it was at that point that I realized that I needed to get help, because similarly to pressure, anxiety, it's double-edged swords. Anxiety in some ways can be a really good thing. Again, it fuels and drives you forward. Pressure in a good way fuels and drives you forward. It can help you get to peak performance. But again, when is that tipping point that actually becomes too much and that you are unable to cope? Yeah. So that's
Yeah.
kind of brief snapshot for me.
Yeah. I mean, and I think you brought up a good point, which it seems to be a recurring theme in all our questions, and that's the fact that I suppose when it becomes chronic, when it
Mm-hmm.
just doesn't seem like there's going to be a stop date, an expiry date on it, that's when it starts to really become a problem, because you're like, oh
Mm-hmm.
no, is this going to be my life now? Am I just going to be anxious forever? Am I going to feel like I'm in a pressure cooker forever, or
Mm-hmm.
stress, or whatever you want to call it? How did you kind of, you know, figure out a solution for yourself?
Before I answer that, I also just want to say, because that's a really valid point about this kind of never ending, when will it stop? And I think that people are really struggling with that at the moment in the face of the pandemic, because it's not like we have a finish line in sight, that we can see the end of the race and we know how long we need to just hold on for. Instead, we are in an endurance race. And quite frankly, as a world, we are not perhaps equipped to be able to deal with an endurance race when you're running at that heightened level of anxiety. And there's so much uncertainty. That's the one thing that is persistent and guaranteed, is that there is uncertainty at the moment. And so it's just really interesting that we're kind of living in that at the moment. But for me, how I dealt with it is I took a real step back. Like, I did what was needed and met the kind of targets and demands that were required. But in terms of, I really stepped back and looked at my entire life. So I calmed down my social life. I stopped drinking. I stopped smoking. I took up exercise. I made sure that I got sleep every night. All of these small things individually might well not have a profound impact. Well, they can for sure, but they might well not. For me, it wasn't like, and I cut out caffeine. It wasn't as though I stopped having coffee and all of a sudden, ta-da, I'm cured.
Yeah.
But actually, all of these things, and really reflecting on what was important for me and what was happening in my body, and educating myself and working out what I needed to do to still operate at my best, was really important. And actually, it's interesting, no one knew that I was struggling. The battle for myself, when I talked about the internal and external at the very beginning when we were discussing pressure, that was very real for me, because my internal dialogue was deafening, super loud. I couldn't hear anything else. But actually, on an external level, no one had a clue. No one had any idea. Um, and I think we're often our harshest to ourselves. And so how can we make sure that we are kinder and more forgiving, more understanding?
Yeah. I think that might be the most relatable thing, where our internal dialogue is so noisy and loud that we forget that the people around us are just so unaware, and they probably
Mm-hmm.
don't even realize the struggle you have. And so I suppose it's kind of like the best way to equalize it is, number one, to speak about it, and
Mm-hmm.
number two, to have feedback so that you kind of know that, because if you do that uh, a lot, you'll probably figure out that most people will be like, "Oh, I didn't know that you felt this way," So that's a good point.
Yeah, that's a great point that you mentioned, because our support networks, both in terms of friends and family, but also those at work or mentors, coaches, can offer really invaluable information and feedback, that feedback loop, because I think sometimes we don't give ourselves enough credit, and actually hearing those reflections or how you're perceived can be really powerful. There's also a lovely Winnie Winnie the Pooh quote that I love that says, "You are braver than you believe, stronger than you seem, and smarter than you think." Isn't that so cool?
I
That's what we
know.
should remind ourselves every
Yeah.
day.
I love that it's Winnie the Pooh, because
I know.
it's interesting because they always have the best quotes too, right? Like, and it's so
Mhm.
subtle, and they kind of embed it in you as a child, and that's what I
Mhm.
love about it.
I completely agree. I have two young kids, so reading bedtime stories is amazing because there's so much valuable information in them. And yeah, my absolute favorite book is The Places You'll Go by
I've
Dr.
not heard
Z.
of that.
I'd highly recommend you to read it.
Okay, I
It's
will. Yeah.
a complete winner.
Yeah, I will. I definitely will now. I before I forget, I wanted
Mhm.
to add on to a point that you mentioned, about making these small changes. And it was funny because I
Mhm.
interviewed a pro tennis player for the podcast. And that was something she was saying as well, right? She says, yeah, these small changes, in a regular game, you won't feel it. Like you won't notice that these changes make a big difference. But then there will be a time where you will find someone who pushes you to a 2 hour, 3 hour match. And that's when these small things play a part, because
Mhm.
then you rely on those small ways to refocus, to be attentive to these small things.
Mhm.
So yeah, so that's the thing, right? It's in a regular setting, you'll be like, yeah, not drinking coffee doesn't make a difference. But then when you're under high levels of stress, and you're not so wired,
Mhm.
then you realize the value of your actions.
Mhm. Yeah, it's really important as well to be able to acknowledge that. I think that as a um, often with people, they barely pause to acknowledge that something has gone very well. They don't take that time to celebrate the successes. And actually, like your podcast member, is that actually those things had a real impact. They made a real difference, and they should be acknowledged. I think, even in general life, if you make 1 or 2 degrees, think of if that goes out from the center of a circle, how far that will go. So even the smallest thing, although initially at the beginning you'll be at the center of the circle, actually when you take that out, think how far that's going to go. Think of the ripple effect of that, and it will lead you to have those better moments.
Yeah, that's so true. Yeah, it's definitely worth a thought.
The other thing that's worth noting, which I'm sure came up in the other podcast, is we hold these other people to a really high standard. Pro tennis players, or even someone, I love using Usain Bolt when talking about these kind of things, because he's amazing, but by God, he has pressure. Every single time that he turns up to a race, there is pressure for him to win. Now, how does he use that to propel him forward? And how does he use that to make him perform at the best that he is able to do? But he is no different to you and I. he is still a human being. He still has these pressure points, but he will have taken the time to understand who he is as a person, what makes him tick, what his pressure points are for him personally, and what he needs to do to get around it.
Yeah.
And we are all facing pressure, but how can we make sure that it doesn't become overwhelming is what distinguishes between like good and great, good and excellent.
Yeah. And to add to that, I was supposed to speak to this podcast guest, but we haven't had the time. But she's a sports psychologist for a famous, well, I guess, famous enough U.S. pro sports team. And she spoke about this actually. She said that, you know, they did a very intense study on all the key sports athletes to kind of understand how to deal with pressure. And over time, they realized that actually, even the best, if you think of, like your Mickey Mantles all the way to LeBron James, they statistically, they never performed better than anyone, in an NBA final or what you call it. So none of the best performed better. They either performed the same or below average. But what they did better than everyone else was stay consistent. And I thought that was the best way to humanize success, right? We think of all these guys and they're like, oh, we'll never be like them. But really what they do better than us is just to stay consistent.
I love that. Consistency is so key. And I think that's a really important point. When dealing with pressure or anxiety, people often wait for those moments of high pressure or high anxiety to do something. They suddenly think, uh-oh, I need to act fast. And then they implement amazing things that happen for the next, I don't know, 2 weeks, 2 days, 2 weeks, 2 months. And then they start feeling good again. And they think, great, I'm now back to me. I'm back to myself. I don't need to maintain that. Whereas, like you're saying, the people who are at the peak performance are people who consistently commit to all of this.
Yeah.
This entire thing. It's a commitment to build that consistency.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, I haven't stopped thinking about it since she told me. I almost feel like I don't need to interview her anymore. Like I got the best part.
You're done. Yeah.
So what made you write a book about dealing with anxiety?
So for me, when I was really struggling and I searched high and low, I think going back to that feeling of loneliness, of not really confiding in many people. I had a very small support network of a coach, my husband, and my immediate family members. But beyond that, I was so keen to get back to me and not show anyone that I had, and I'm doing inverted commas again, but a weakness. And that's what it felt like. And so I searched high and low for anything and everything that I could find, and read a whole host of books and TED Talks. You think it, I probably did it. And I would read these books, and ultimately, not dissimilar to what you've just said about that potential podcast lady, is you just get one gem from a book. It's 350 pages on deep breathing, which is amazing. Deep breathing is so important. I'll come back to deep breathing later. But what I wanted was a book that had all the information that I need, that I could dip in and out of at my own pace and find something that was relevant and useful in any given moment. And what's important to note is that things change. What might work for me today. So, for example, if I do deep breathing today, actually, 3 weeks from now, I might need to do a meditation, or I might need to do some values work. It might be a very different thing that's needed. And so ultimately, I wrote this book for myself as a one-stop shop, a kind of a book that I could return to in time and time again, and just follow, dip in and out of as I needed it. So it's for myself. I just hope that maybe one other person might find it useful.
Yeah, I feel that's that's the case for a lot of the things we do, right? Like it's all, well, number one, it's to get it out of ourselves, and to put it onto paper, or to put it in a document. But I think it's also a way for us to look back at our experience and what we've learned from it and how we've experienced it. But then, of course, then we share it with the world. But yeah, I mean, that's how I kind of felt about this podcast as well. In my mind, I had this, actually mine was a bit of the reverse. I had this intention like, oh, I want it to be, like a super popular podcast. I want to be famous from it. But then as I continue to go on, I'm like, oh, actually the benefit I get from it is not actually the people who listen, but the value I get from the people I interview as well as the people I meet, because I wouldn't otherwise have met them. And for me, this is just like a valuable experience. So now, like, just my priorities has kind of changed. So it's just interesting. I suppose my point, in a long-winded way, is I guess you never really know what actually is the true value of what you're doing until you just go through that process.
Definitely. And it also speaks to the point of, we change over time. Different things will come through that are of varying importance to us, and we can change. If for any of your listeners, if they have got a relationship to pressure, anxiety that is not working, they are able to change that. And our brains, there's amazing research done on neuroplasticity, and I mean, as the name suggests, our brains are so flexible. They are plastic and able to mold and pick up new habits. So we can change things. There's hope.
And that's a good segue to the next question I had, which is, what do you wish for people to know about dealing and overcoming anxiety?
Well, first of all, that it's possible. Not to overcome anxiety, but to make anxiety work for you in the right way. So anxiety, and as with pressure, will always ebb and flow in our lives. But how can we have a good relationship to it is just very powerful. And also be kind. We meet people and make judgments, or we feel let down by someone if they back out of a plan last minute. And actually, we don't know what's happening in their world. And I hadn't appreciated that until I had my experience that we really don't understand other people's version of reality. And that's okay. But being more sympathetic or empathetic towards that and supporting our friends, our teams, our families can be powerful. Be kind, always.
Yeah. I think that is a portion of what you said is the truest words I've heard, yet also at the same time a little bit of an oxymoron, because our version of reality is just, it's just, by definition that it doesn't make sense. But in reality, that's like the truest thing. Everyone experiences the same situation in a different way. And I suppose the problem is whether it's the lack of time or lack of empathy, we don't take the time to understand that reality.
And isn't that sad? Because everyone's going through their lives. Everyone's got their thing. And just because from where you're standing, it seems easy, or it looks simple, or the path is clear, doesn't mean that the person who's in it can see that. And so having that level of understanding, or like you say, taking that time and truly listening, like really listening, not thinking you're listening, but not really listening, but actually listening, can be so profound. And actually, that's what people are crying out for. When you really hear someone, when you really see them, that is when like the deepest connections can happen.
Yeah. Intentional listening, right? The hardest skill, but the greatest gift, I guess.
Lovely way to put it. Yeah. Absolutely.
I'd like to ask one final question. And it's a
Mm-hmm.
reflective one and always my favorite question to ask. What life lesson has, what life lesson has, I don't know, taken you the longest to learn or you feel strongly about?
You've kind of got me stumped. What life lesson has taken me the longest to learn?
Yeah, and maybe to help, I can put in some context to simplify it. Right, we all go through experiences, and there's that. I tend to notice that we all have something that, like, we're aware of that solution, but we refuse to believe that that is the way. And I'm wondering what that is for the people I asked that question to.
That's a really good question. I don't know whether it'd probably just be around what we've just discussed, is that truly people are going through their own journeys and we are not alone. We can be open, we can be vulnerable, we can call on our support networks. And ultimately, I don't know, I believe in karma. What goes around comes around. If you can be there for other people and be positive, be kind, it will just come back. I believe that fully.
That's so true. Yeah, very well said. A funny anecdote. So I watch a sports show. Like, it's a daily show, and one of the hosts always says, I mean, it's kind of like his ongoing theme where he says, karma is interesting because sometimes it's like Amazon Prime, it comes the next day. And sometimes you wait ages and you wonder whether your good deed bears fruit. I always think of that. It's like so true, like yeah.
Maybe that should be my life lesson. Yeah. Karma's like Amazon Prime. I love that. And you're wondering, like, where on earth is that parcel? Is it in the middle of the ocean somewhere? How can I get it back? That's a great way to put it.
That one. I want to give the time to you because I know you do. You're a coach as well, and also your book is coming out. Perhaps you can speak about a little bit about both, and how they can either get a hand or get a copy of your book, or to get in touch if they're interested in coaching.
That's really kind of you. Thank you. So the book is not being released until next May, but it's very exciting. So I hope that all the listeners will be interested when it does come out. But I believe that it's now available for pre-order on Amazon. And so I'm sure we can put it in a show note.
And also when it launches, for sure. I mean, when it actually launches, let me know and I can put out another blast.
That's very kind of you. Thank you. And yes, on a personal level, so I've been coaching for a number of years now and love working with people who are struggling. And, well, not necessarily struggling. I love working with the Usain Bolts who just want to be even better, but also people who may have reached that moment and don't know where to turn to. And so they are able to perform consistently at their best, regardless of the challenges, regardless of the setbacks. And by using a kind of a concoction of leadership development and neuroscience and coaching techniques, be able to give them the choices, make sustained choices to live a better life, a happier life. It's quite simple.
And how can they get in touch?
I've got my website, westbourneassociates.com. And you can also follow me on LinkedIn, Agi Heale, or on Instagram. Yeah, would love to. Please do connect. Happy to hear from you.
Cool. And I'll put it in the descriptions too.
Thank you. Thanks so much.
Yeah. Well, Agi, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for taking the time.
You're welcome. Thank you so much for having me.
Cheers.